Morning, good afternoon, depending where you're joining from. Welcome to the International Safeguarding Conference. This is our opening webinar for this year's event, and we're all extremely excited to start this journey all together. I'm joined by Tina and by Alessandra, who are part of the executive committee with me, part of the organizing committee of this event. I'm delighted to have Judi Fairholm with us today. I'll introduce her in a minute. We also have Mr. Stuart Allardyce, who will be the keynote for next week with us today. And we also have Professor Sheila Hollins with us, who will be speaking later on in June, in our webinar in June. So thank you, Judi, Stuart, and Sheila for joining us today, and for everyone else, of course, for supporting this initiative and for joining in this event, which obviously we find is very important for the church and for us to have these opportunities to talk, to communicate, to learn from each other, and to build on best practices around the world and to build a network in this very important and delicate sector. Just before going ahead, as you probably noticed on your screen, the session is being recorded. Obviously, we will be sharing this recorded event with our colleagues in the Pacific and Asia for their event, which will be happening later on today. Just as an introduction, I just want to read an important notice from our end as an information for all of you who are participating in this event. So during an event like this one, where people attend a webinar to explore different aspects of safeguarding, it's not uncommon to experience a range of emotions, and some of them can potentially be disturbing thoughts or even memories. These experiences can stem from the experience of trauma and its impact, and can affect anyone, particularly people who have experienced abuse directly. We would ask you that you take good care of yourself during this webinar. Some of the presentations are being recorded live. The use of the chat feature is for questions for keynote speakers, and it is possible that they will appear in the recording. So please, we ask you to avoid using the chat function, maybe to exchange personal greetings with other participants. You can chat directly with them if that's what you would like to do, but not to a chat to everyone. We also wish to advise that it is possible that your image will be included in the recording, or that individual participants may take a screenshot and share it on social media, with the intention of obviously promoting an important aspect of the webinar content. If you are going to post on social media, we ask you to use two hashtags just so the conversation can be linked, either hashtag prevention post pandemic or hashtag safer church. I'll write it later on in the chat. So what's going to happen today? So we're delighted to have Judi Fairholm with us today. Judi is a safeguarding consultant. She is a senior associate with Protecnon Consulting, and she also works for the Alliance. Okay. And today she's going to be talking to us on becoming a trauma-informed church and the impact that the pandemic had on children, on families, and on the communities. So Judy's going to have a 30-minute slot to present her keynote. If you have any questions for Judi, you have two options. You either write it in the general chat, and then myself or the team will collect these questions, so then we can ask Judi later on when she finishes a keynote, or you can send a private message to any one of the hosts, so either to myself or to Alessandra or to Tina. Okay, so you just send the question. Maybe you want it to be private, you don't want your name to show, you can send the message directly to us. Because after the 30 minutes after the keynote, Judi will have we will give around 10, maximum 15 minutes for a question and answer. So if there are any questions, we can put them to Judi, and she can answer you live on this webinar. After the question and answer, we're going to have a few minutes break. to refresh, maybe to go and have a cup of coffee or cup of tea, whatever you prefer to do. And then after an hour, we will start the breakout rooms. So each of you will be assigned to a breakout room. You have a facilitator in the room who will be guiding through the discussion in the breakout room. The breakout room we anticipate will take around 45 minutes, not more than that. So in all, within an hour and 45 minutes latest, the event we will stop, will be finished. Okay. So I now leave the mic to Judi, and I invite Judi um, uh, to present her keynote, and then, as I said before, we will have time for questions after Judi. Judi, up to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. It is great to be here with you. I first of all want to start by saying that it's important that you know I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a psychiatrist. But what I have done is that I've worked a lot in the psychosocial field, in the safeguarding field, and in the violence prevention field. So these are the lenses that I'm bringing to this and to our discussion today. And so I'm very much looking forward to not only going through the slides that I've prepared for you, but also afterwards the discussion. And so that I can hear your perspective and also learn from you. And then together we can put this together. At the beginning, we're just going to go through the basics and the basics of what is trauma. And Andrew's going to change the slides for us. So if you want to change to that next one, Andrew. And I know that most of you know this, but I think it's important that we just start at this point to make sure that we're sort of all on the same page of how do we really understand trauma, what are the types of trauma, how do we recognize it, and then how do we respond to it, and then how are we held accountable as individuals and as a church to be trauma informed. So these are the critical things I want to talk to you about. And as we talk about them, I'm hoping that you can keep in mind a person, someone you know, either in your family or that you've met through your profession or that you've met through the church or in your community, who has experienced trauma. And as we go through this, I want you to think of that person and think about how you recognized it or would recognize it and what would have worked best with them. So let's first of all go and define what is trauma. So the next slide, please. Okay, so trauma is, and I think it's really important to think of it this way because it makes it quite easy, is that if we think of the 3 E's of trauma, that trauma is an event, it's an experience, and it's an effect. And if we think of that, what is that event that has happened to somebody? What is that experience? And everybody experiences things differently. I know often I've said to people, pain is pain is pain is pain, and one cannot compare one's pain to one other's pain. So the effect of the trauma becomes very different. So we as individuals will respond to the experience very differently. So the way to really keep thinking about it is, what is the event? What is the experience that that person had? And what is the impact? What is the effect on them? And then now let's break it down to the types of trauma. And that will be the next slide. So the types of trauma that I think, and I know that there are many ways that trauma can be broken down, but this is just a way that works for me and I hope works for you, is that there can be an acute trauma, which is really an isolated event, and that could be an accident or a natural disaster or a single act of violence, or there's a sudden loss, there's been a sudden car accident and there's been a loss, there's been injury. So that's sudden acute trauma. So that's one type of trauma that people can experience. And then we have chronic trauma, And lately, this has often also been described as slow violence. And this is when it's long and it's prolonged. And chronic poverty is one example of this. Domestic violence that happens over and over again. Person who's experiencing long-term illness. Kids at school who are experiencing chronic bullying day in and day out. People who are being displaced because of wars or because of disasters. That would be chronic violence, chronic trauma. And then we have complex trauma. And this is where there's multiple things coming to a person, and it's usually events that start from a very early age. And this is a combination of the acute and of the chronic. And you can see a lot is written up about this when you look at adverse childhood experiences and what that impact is on children over their whole lifetime. So it can be the ongoing abuse, it's neglect, it's witnessing domestic violence, all those type of things come under complex. And then we have historical trauma. And this is when we have trauma that is across generations. So it's generations and generations of trauma. And we have seen this quite a bit lately when there's the Black Lives Matter. All across the world, this has been accentuated. And also in Canada, we have a really, really tragic example of this with Indigenous people and what has happened to Indigenous people in Canada over the last 200 or more years of when kids were taken from their people, were put in residential schools. All of that type of thing is historical trauma, which is systemic oppression, racism, and discrimination. And then let's go to look at mass trauma. This is the next type. The next slide, please. So mass trauma, which is coming from pandemics, coming from wars, coming from economic downturns. And this is when a large number of people are traumatized and their relationships are altered, their connections to the broader social systems are ruptured, and their function as citizens is undermined. And some of the literature calls this the basic tissues of social life have been gone. The original rituals, the way we operate in the world, all those type of things, our sense of destiny, our relationship with others is all dissolved. And then people become traumatized not only as an individual, but also as a community. And when this goes unprocessed or undiscussed, or perhaps actually repressed, then this group's social tissues remain disturbed and unhealed, and individual trauma builds up and it becomes community trauma. So in 2000 till 2019, there were 3.9 billion people who were affected by over 6,000 climate-related disasters. So that could build into a mass trauma. And this was an 81% increase from 1980 to 1999. So this was really a critical one. But even more than what has happened in that time is what we've been living through since 2019, and that is the pandemic. So let's look at that and the mass trauma that the pandemic has brought on us. Next slide, please. So the COVID-19, we've all lived this. And I'm sure what I'm talking about has been front and center for all of you in the newspapers and for those of you who do research. So let's just do a little overview of what has been happening. And I think one of the things that is really important is that it's not only a public health emergency, but it's an economic crisis, it's a social crisis, it's a human crisis, and it's a human rights crisis that we're in the midst of, and that is giving really the world a mass trauma. So as of last night, when I looked, there was 164,083,575 COVID-19 cases in the world. And there have been 3,399,543 deaths. And when we look at the deaths, I think one of the really tragic ones is a recent research that came out that one child is losing a caregiver every 12 seconds due to COVID-19. And so we have children every 12 seconds who's losing the important person in their life due to this COVID, and this is trauma. We also know that for every person who has died, there are 9 grieving loved ones in the immediate family. So it means that that is just spreading out and spreading out. When we look at poverty, we know that there's a great number of people who are living in poverty, but COVID-19 has added 270 million people into poverty. And when we look at abject poverty, so the poor of the poor, that now there's 40 to 60 million more people who would be classified the poor, and that is people who live on less than a US dollar, $1.90 per day. When we look at what's happened with the school, we know that 1.5 billion children have been affected by school closures, and that we still, even as they're starting to go back, there's 214 million kids that still remain out of school. And though that a lot of places went onto remote learning and learning by computers, we know that at least 1 in 3 school children were unable to access remote learning. When we look at the economics, we know that there has been the broadest collapse in per capita income since 1870, and that the global economic loss is around US dollars, $268 billion. And then let's look at mental health. So across the world, like 93% of the countries have been unable to provide mental health support. And so in many ways, this is now becoming the second pandemic that we're facing, is this mental health support. And that's why I think this is so important that you're spending this time thinking about how does the church respond to this incredible gap that is happening all across the world. The other interesting thing I think to just remember is that when we look at mental health issues, that there's some interesting stats coming out now that says all mental health disorders, at least half of all mental health disorders, start in some way by the age of 14. And 3/4 of mental health disorders are set in by the mid-20s. So when you think about what's been happening to children around schools, around the isolation, around losing so much community, and then you know that they are so vulnerable for mental health issues around their teenage years, this is something we really need to be aware of. And 2/3 of countries with full or partial closures for schools have been in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this area has really struggled and is continuing to struggle right now. Okay, let's go and look at this. I thought this was a really interesting graph to just highlight what is happening around people being pushed into extreme poverty, so that you can see that it starts really small in North America and Europe, and then it starts increasing into Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Middle East and North Africa, and then East Asia and Pacific, and then South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So that this is your slow violence that became very rapid in this last year, and that it is a chronic trauma that is caused by mass trauma. Okay, let's look at I put this one in here because I think it also highlights the inequalities. Sort of just a snapshot of, again, what has happened across the world with the pandemic. And the percentage of homes that have an internet and computers give us this snapshot. So you can see that there is a huge difference between Europe and Americas with Africa. You can see that you can look at the developed countries versus the developing countries. So that the developing countries are less than half having access to computers and internet in their homes. And then when you look at the least developed countries, you see how small, what a small number they had as far as having the internet and computers. Now, this is a really interesting phenomenon we have, because we know, and I'll touch on it on my next slide, is actually we know that having increased access to computers has opened up people being able to be educated, and that kids won't fall so far behind due to the pandemic. But also we know there's an incredible number of risks for what's happening with the kids online. So it's a really, this is a balance, but I just wanted to show you the difference of what's happened in the world around the pandemic and their access to education and information. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in many ways, there has been a shadow pandemic that has happened with the mass pandemic. And I think that the way to describe it best is to say that the pandemic did not lead to a lockdown of violence. In fact, the pandemic led to much more violence. So there's an incredible increase in gender-based violence by 15 million more cases every 3 months since we went into pandemic. That there is violence prevention and services and responses have been decreased and disappeared in basically, our latest count was in over 104 countries. That we know that children with disabilities are at high risk before the pandemic came, and we know that their risk has increased remarkably. And then I just mentioned to you about online, and we know that online, that the risks and the dangers in online have grown over and over again. So we have sexual exploitation, we have children having access to sexualized services, we have increased in trafficking, we have few online programs that have any safeguarding built into them. So the online risks are huge. And then in 37 countries in households that have been studies, and I just want to accentuate this point, that when the pandemic started, it started and there was lots of news coming out, and our information was around the news, and now the academic research is starting to come out and really show us what actually happened. So you can see in these households that this research was done on, that there was an incredible increase of children reporting violence that was happening in their household compared to when the children went to school. So all of this has led to feelings of anxiety, depression, and isolation. Okay, go to the next slide, Andrew. So I put this slide in because I wanted you to just see what some of the research is showing. So we see, and this is just emerging data of violence against women and girls and COVID-19, is that in France, we have a 30% increase. In Argentina, the domestic violence emergency calls have increased by 25%. And in Cyprus, 30%, and then Singapore, 33%. That's been the increase to helplines. And then we're just starting to see research coming out of Canada, Germany, and the other countries to show us what's happening there. So let's look at the impact. So we know that the impact is huge. that there's anger, there's sadness, there's despair, there's depression, there's guilt, people feeling overwhelmed, people experiencing flashbacks, going back to experiences that have been really traumatizing, the loss of so many people they care for. There have been unpredictable emotions. There's shame, there's fear, there's hopelessness, there's helplessness, and all of these can all be wrapped up into many, many different physical symptoms. I think one of the interesting things that comes out now that really have been able to discover and understand since the mapping of the brain is the impact of stress and trauma on the brain. And so in this diagram, you can see that in the prefrontal section that is responsible for our executive function, with stress, there is a real elevation in brain chemistry. And in the amygdala, that where there is a trigger for emotional responses, that's the section that goes, am I being threatened? And how am I going to respond to this? That really gets triggered and can be, there's a lot of stress, then the development of this area is at risk. And then the hippocampus, where we have term memory, this connects fear to the context. So the fear and that where that event happened, that is where it's affected. And we know now that stress and trauma can actually impact areas of the brain like these, and also the synapses in the brain and how the brain gets wired. And if we go to the next slide, I just is one I put in here to just show you actually what a depressed brain looks like. So we know that when we go back to those impacts, that there's the impact of despair and sadness, and that moves into depression. And that now we can map the brain. And so you can see in this brain that the brain, the depressed brain, is just shutting down. There's like the undepressed brain is firing on every level, and the depressed brain is shutting down. This is what is happening to people all over the world. So I like this quote on this next slide, that when a flower doesn't bloom, I just have to read that again. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment, not the flower. I like that because that then means that we need to go to the social ecological model. And the social ecological model is very interesting because it says that you have to see the individual within their relationships and their family, within their community, which includes their church, within their society, and within their cultural values. And that if we can get the picture of all of this, and we can decide how we're going to understand this individual, then there's ways that we can really help them. So let's go to the next slide. We've talked about a lot of the risks that have happened with COVID-19. So the risks that happen with domestic violence and isolation and lack of support system, all these type of risks. But I think it's also important that we need to know what are the protective factors so that we can build on those protective factors and use them as we work towards how we can be a trauma-informed church. So protective factors like in the individual level, that there's empathy and people that we build on healthy coping skills and sense of humor. In relationships, we look for where can there be positive role models and social support and equality, senses of belonging. And in the community and church, again, that belonging sense, which is so critical. The basic needs are met, and there's faith and there's hope. And when we look at wellness, we understand that there is security and basic needs and healthy relationships and a self-determination, that we have that understanding all coming together. And then we look at the social culture and we understand the philosophy and the values and the ethics. So all those are protective factors that we can build on. So how are we going to do this? Well, I think that, and this is the next slide, thanks, Andrew. I think that Hopeful's 5 essential elements really provide us a map for being able to do this. That would go to the next slide, Andrew, please. There we go. So in these elements, and Hopful is a psychologist who has written a lot and done a lot of research in this area, and he really has driven these 5 essential elements within the psychosocial world. And what the five essential elements are, the first one is safety, that the person needs to feel safe and secure. And then the second one is calmness. How do we work from a sense of calmness with people, and how do we promote calmness in people? And then the third one is connectedness. And what does that connectedness look like? And that ties into that sense of belonging that I was talking about with that last slide. And then from connectedness, we go into self-efficacy, which actually moves into a community efficacy. So as individuals begin to feel stronger and that they can make decisions and do things, the community becomes stronger. And then the last critical one is hope. How do we build on hope, and how do we give hope? So let's just look at these a little bit more, and that will take you to the next slide, Andrew. Under safety. Safety, if we don't have safety for our people and for our community, then we might as well stop. Because without safety, people cannot grow. They cannot go where they need to go. And so safety, you need to think about, okay, what are the safeguarding systems that we have in place? What is the protective shield that we've put around our people? What are we doing risk assessments? Are we understanding everywhere that we are ministering to people, that we are connecting with people, that this is a safe environment? And for our people, and especially for our young people, do we have safety plans? Do they have safety plans? Do they know about safety and our concern about safety? Do we understand the vulnerabilities? Have we identified the people who are more vulnerable than other people? And how do we offer stability and predictability to them? So those are all the things to think about, and there's probably many more to think about in safety. And then calmness. How do we approach people with empathy and with acknowledging their pain? How do we listen to them? How do we know what we're seeing? So when we're looking at them and we see things, how do we understand that? And how do we work to regulate our own emotions and encouraging other people to understand regulation of emotions? So how do we bring that calmness into all that we do with people? And then the third one is connection. So within our community, how do we build connections with family? How do we build connections within our church? Have we mapped and known where we can link people, where we can refer them to when we're feeling that their trauma and their experience is more than what we can deal with? And how are we building a sense of belonging so that people really feel that they belong here? This is part of them and part of their health. And then the next one is self and community efficacy. So what problem-solving strategies do we bring in? How do we instill purpose and identity? And how do we give people the skills and knowledge? And one of the things that is being used quite a bit in many places around the world is a program that first came out with WHO, and then different organizations have picked it up, and it's called psychological first aid. So as people take first aid to learn how to deal with injuries, this is psychological first aid, so that we can learn actually, what do we listen to? How do we look at things and understand things, and how do we link people? And that all goes back to the mapping and all of that type of thing. And then the last really big one is hope. And how do we change hopelessness into hope? How do we build on the faith that people have? And how do we take people so that they learn to trust themselves first, and then they learn to trust others, especially people who have gone through such traumatizing experiences like we first discussed. So these are the 5 essential elements that I want you to keep in mind as you go into your discussion on actually how do we apply these so that we can become a trauma-informed church. And then the next slide, please. So how are we going to hold ourselves accountable for this? Like, we can say that we want to be a trauma-informed church, we want to reach people, we want to help people. But how do we really know, say, a year from now or 2 years from now, if we've actually reached this goal? How are we going to do it? So these are just some ideas that I threw together, and I'm sure you probably have many more. So let's just look at these quickly. First of all, I think if there's a budget line, is there a budget line for trauma-informed practice? Because if it's a budget line, then it will be something that you will definitely follow through on. Is it on the agenda? So is there an agenda that actually, the governance agenda is that the topic is actually put on the agenda on a regular basis? Is it in the operational plan? Is there an operational plan where actually one sits and plans, how would we build these 5 elements into the church? And if we've, and in many churches, you've already built it in, but then how do we build on that? And what are the barriers if we haven't been able to get through to that? And then have we really involved the parishioners in our planning and in this accountability? And when programs are for children, are we actually listening to children and getting them to be involved in this and what works for them? And then we can just go to plain numbers. So what is the number of times that trauma-informed practice has been in sermons or on retreats or in gatherings or in educational settings? And what is the number of parishioners that have been educated on this topic, either in psychological first aid or something like that? And what are the number of pamphlets and newsletters and podcasts and webinars or videos or whatever communicating with the community? How many of those are out there and giving people ideas of where they can link to or what you can do to help them? And what are the number of calls and reports to helplines, to counselors, to priests, to peer support groups? And is there a valuation feedback done on a yearly basis that will give you some idea of what is happening? So those are just some of the ideas to think of for looking and holding yourselves accountable for doing this. And I really like this saying because I think in many ways this is the hope that is talked about by Hopeful and by so many others. The hope is, help me make my faith stronger than my fear. Because if we look back and we understand trauma, fear is the huge, huge issue. So how do we counter that fear with faith? Now there's going to be 2 questions that you're going to go into discussion later on. And one is going to be on how you bring your own experiences in understanding this and what are your learnings about this. And then the second one is going to be on how do you take the Hopeful's 5 essential elements and apply them to your own area of work and what's already in place, and then what are the barriers that you could overcome. And then the last thing that I want to leave you with, and this is if you go to the last slide, Andrew, is that I think we have just started now in looking at how to recognize and respond to trauma. And after your discussions and the feedback that you give, then I think in our next session, let's look at how do we recover and how do we reimagine what we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judi, for the very interesting and lovely presentation. I just want to remind everyone who's listening, if you have any questions, please send them to either pop them in the chat or send them to Alessandra, to Tina, or to myself. Judi, I have some questions for you already, so I'm going to share them with you. So before you mentioned safety plans for children, and one of our participants wondered whether you could say more about the content, excuse me, the context in which a child within the church could be subject to a safety plan and what it might address or include.
I think safety plans for children are really important. And I think it involves asking children where, about their lives and where they feel safe and where they don't feel safe. And they'll tell you, and where they don't feel safe, then have that discussion of what to do when you don't feel safe. Also, I think it's important for children to define really clearly who are the adults in their life that they trust, and that they have, either it's on a piece of paper or it's on their phone, depending on what age they are, that they have those names and those numbers, and that they then actually talk to that person and they say, when I'm not feeling safe, or if something's happening that's bothering me, can I phone you? Can I text you? And that they actually then know that they have this safety bubble around them, and that these are the people who are around them to keep them safe. So it's helping the kids understand where they're feeling unsafe and their risks, and then giving them a support plan and safety plan around that.
Thank you, Judi. Another question for you. So, could we say that the church as a community experiences all types of trauma in different geographical places and cultures, or is there a specific type of trauma in your experience that applies more than others?
Wow, I don't know if I can speak for the world. I would think that I think the church experiences all type of trauma, because we have all type of people walking through the doors. The church is made up of the community, represents the community, and people come with all different types of trauma. I think the big one that is now overlaying all of those individual, acute, chronic, complex, historical traumas is now the pandemic. And so we have a big festering wound of trauma in front of us. And I don't think we'll know for quite a few years about the mental anguish that has all accumulated in 2019 and 2020.
Thank you for that, Judi. Just one more for now, at least. So, would the increased reporting by the police of domestic violence during COVID-19, so the increased reporting of domestic violence, in your opinion, would that be considered as mass trauma?
The increased reporting, okay, so I just need to understand the question, Andrew. Is it the increased reporting of police violence or of domestic violence to police?
The latter, domestic violence to police.
The domestic violence to police, would that be considered mass trauma? I think the mass trauma is the pandemic. The domestic violence is a chronic trauma, because we know domestic violence happens over and over again. We know for women, there was one study that women will go back to the abuser 35 times before they can leave. So you think of that, and you think of the children in the home witnessing that violence, and you know that that is a chronic violence. You also know that in some places and in many, not some, in many, and in many families, there is historical domestic violence. So you see it going down through generations. And so you also have historical trauma on that front also.
So I'm going to try to word this question a bit. So do you think that Catholics who might have chosen to leave the church be a result of them experiencing trauma as well as the church being, or is it more the church's inadequacy in ministering them when they're leaving? I mean, it's a difficult question for you to answer in your position, but this is the question that was put, so to speak. So if it's if people are leaving as a result of trauma or because of the church is inadequately responding to them as a result of the trauma.
You know, I can't answer that because I think everybody has their own story and their own coping mechanisms. So I wouldn't attempt to answer that. I would just say that I think that our understanding of trauma is increasing and increasing rapidly. And so you see now that there is more and more emphasis on trauma-informed schools so that teachers can understand when they see a child misbehaving in front of them, it's not that they are coming to punish or discipline that child, but they're understanding, again, in that socio-ecological model, what really is happening to this child to make them behave this way. And so I think it's absolutely really critical and really good that you as a church are thinking, how do we become trauma-informed church? Because you are dealing with people and people need to be understood what's happened to them and how that's impacting them.
Thank you very much.